Good evening, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased that you could be with us tonight, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on our YouTube channel. Tonight's program, For Us, By Us, America's Trust in and Expectations of the Constitution, is presented in partnership with the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier, and we thank them for their support. Before we hear from tonight's guests, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up later this month. On Friday, September 21st at 5 o'clock, we'll host the next Nixon Legacy Forum discussion on the topic, The Greatest Comeback, Richard Nixon in the Election of 1968. And then on Thursday, September 27th at 7, we present Historians on Hamilton, How a Blockbuster Musical is Restaging America's Past. We'll bring together a group of top scholars to explain the Hamilton phenomenon and explore its connection to the understanding of American history. Check our website at archives.gov or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership at archivesfoundation.org. And a little-known secret that I keep telling everyone about, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. More than 1 million people a year come through the National Archives Museum to see the Constitution and Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights. And I would hazard a guess that such a sense of personal connection to a national constitution is uniquely American. We even have a National Day of Recognition to honor the birth of our national government. Each year we celebrate Constitution Day on September 17th, the date the delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the U.S. Constitution in 1787. It's long been a tradition at the National Archives to mark this anniversary with public activities like yesterday's naturalization ceremony for new citizens, family days, lectures, and programs like this evening's panel discussion. I'm eager to hear what our panelists have to say about how Americans today relate to the Constitution, so let's welcome to the stage Kate Imhoff, the President and CEO of the Montpelier Foundation, to get us started. Kate oversees all aspects of the Montpelier Foundation, including the management of the Historic House and Grounds, its education and museum programs, and the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution. Before joining Montpelier, she was the state director for the Nature Conservancy in Montana. She served as executive vice president and chief operating officer for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns and operates Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. Please welcome Kate Imhoff.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it so much. So Michael Beschlaw said, what are you going to do? You've been working at all the MONT places, and I have for the last 3 positions. It is a great honor to be here this evening, and I want to thank David and also Susan Chilton and the National Archives for hosting us again. This is our 8th year at the Archives, and as you said, it is important every year to gather and reflect and honor Constitution Day, what this idea and this document 231 years later means to all of us, an idea of government by and for the people, which is clearly relevant and still strangely feels a little radical. So James Madison, who was called in his lifetime Father of the Constitution, and historians have also referred to him as the architect of the Bill of Rights. Well, when we at the Foundation, the stewards of his home, Montpelier, which, by the way, I just want to point out is an easy 80 miles southeast of here, when we think about James Madison, the image that is often in our mind is this young millennial who is sitting at this desk on the upper floor of Montpelier, and he's gazing towards the Blue Ridge, and sometimes he's sitting, and sometimes he's pacing, and sometimes he's reading and studying, because the American experiment in self-governance was failing under the Articles of Confederation. There was no union of states, no United States. There's just this weak league of friendship. And the individual rights and freedoms that everybody had fought for were so much at risk. In fact, so much had been fought for in 1776, and it was completely on the line in 1786. So Madison developed the core ideas and then, as important, fought tirelessly the rest of his whole life. And he developed these concepts that formed the basis for the United States Constitution, ideas based on a very revolutionary notion that government can indeed protect individual liberties and still govern and provide stability. Was the Constitution, is the Constitution perfect? No. And from the beginning, many of us in this room would not have been protected by that Constitution, and it codified slavery without ever even using the word. But it is also one of our very best ideas, our user's manual, our common ground as Americans in this ongoing democratic experiment. And it is still the oldest Constitution in use in the world. And it has also been called a hinge point in human history, not American history, really as the lead in changing governance all over the globe. Now, Madison said that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And that is why we are here tonight. We are going to arm ourselves with knowledge from this great panel, and also about what we, the people, have been thinking about our constitutional legacy. So a little bit about the survey that we're going to hear discussed, and which, by the way, all of you can take a modified version of if you go to montpelier.org. The Montpelier Foundation commissioned this survey because, in addition to managing Madison's home, we also foster conversations and engage the public around constitutional issues year-round. The Constitution is in every one of our tours, in our work at the Center for the Constitution, and in our thoughts about relevance and public engagement. And frankly, it's really hard to miss references to the Constitution these days. Everything seems to be ripped right from the headlines, whether it's the NFL and the freedom of conscience, women's rights, gun debate, cybersecurity and privacy, or discussions of the balance of powers between the three branches of government. A few facts about the survey. It is a national assessment conducted by Edelman Intelligence of 2,500 Americans representing the diversity of our population. It was a 15-minute online in-depth survey with a margin of error of 2%, and it was conducted in June of this year. Now, we hope that this survey is going to be a benchmark for ongoing conversations and will be repeated in future years. And it was not designed to be a what do you know test, such as can any one of you recite the Fourth Amendment. Those surveys have been done, and frankly, we know that a lot of Americans are not knowledgeable on a day-to-day basis with every word of the Constitution. But instead, we really wanted to understand how demographic attributes affect our perceptions of the safety of personal rights and freedoms, and what are the issues that we as a people are most concerned about, both personally and also for our nation. And as you're going to learn from the panel, we the people have some differences of opinion, not a big surprise. So I'm going to introduce you to the panel, and I also would like to use this moment to welcome our Facebook Live viewers. Broadcast journalist Judy Woodruff is the anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour and has covered politics for more than 4 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. She was one of the first women, along with the late Gwen Ifill, to co-anchor a national news broadcast, is the winner of an extensive list of incredibly well-deserved awards, and one of the most respected names today in news. Judy is also the founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and encouraging women in journalism and communication industries worldwide, and we are very honored to have her here. We're honored to have the entire panel here. Our next panelist, well, he is the professor that we all really wished we'd had in college. Hassan Jeffries is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, where he teaches courses on civil rights and the Black Power movement. He is also an author. Hassan has penned a variety of books, including Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, which tells of the remarkable story of African-American freedom movement in Alabama. Hassan was the lead historian and primary scriptwriter for renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum, which is the site of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is also hosts the podcast Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, a production of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance Project, and he's been a close advisor and friend to Montpelier. And if you come to Montpelier, you'll see him featured in one of our films, The Legacy of Slavery. Our next panelist is Susan Glasser. I'm sure, Susan, you're not busy at all these days. This time of year, as a staff writer for The New Yorker, where your weekly column is Letter from Trump's Washington. Nothing much to say, huh? Prior to The New Yorker, Susan served as founding editor of the award-winning Politico magazine. She's reported everywhere from the halls of Congress to the Battle of Tora Bora. She co-authored Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin, and the End of Revolution with her husband, New York Times chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker. Susan has a vast political reporting experience and worked for a decade at the Washington Post, where she was foreign correspondent, editor of the Post Sunday Outlook, and national news section and political reporter. Last, but certainly not least, is Rachna Chowdhury. She's the co-founder of PopVox. After 10 years of advocacy and lobbying for several national nonprofit organizations, she found there was a disconnect between the people and our lawmakers, and in 2010, the idea for PopVox was born. Since launching in 2011, PopVox has won the social media category at South by Southwest, was ranked number 10 in Mashable's major tech contributions from entrepreneurial women, and was honored at the 2012 Tribeca Disruptive Innovation Awards. That's just such a great award. I just love even the name of it. In 2014, Rachna ranked number 6 in Digital Citizenship Project's Digital Citizens of the Year. You try saying that a couple of times. But at any rate, this is an incredibly powerful lineup of panelists, and I'm now handing this conversation over to Judy Woodruff. Let us welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Kat Imhoff. It's a real treat for me to be here doing this with Montpelier. Thank you, David, for inviting us into your home here at the Archives to be able to use this beautiful, beautiful building, which, as everybody knows, is just a treasure and a place that we come back to again and again. I am so lucky. Well, like Susan, I have to say, first off, not much going on in the news, so there was really easy for all of us to slip away tonight to talk about this. But in seriousness, it's such an important subject, and I am thrilled to be here with these three individuals who have given, from their different perspectives, have given the subject of the Constitution, our rights, so much thought that we will all be the beneficiary of it. I want to start out by just asking the three of you, as you thought about this discussion tonight, and you thought about the Constitution and this survey of Americans and what rights do they take for granted, what rights do they think should be changed, did you go into this thinking Americans have a pretty good grasp of the Constitution? How did you think how did you think about what the Constitution means to them? Rachna?
So working with individuals that want to write letters to Congress, PopVox is all about exercising your right to petition your government. And I had this understanding of people that want to share their voice and have something to say to their lawmakers, but they might not know exactly what's in the Constitution. And that actually showed up in the survey very much. Although most Americans don't know what the Constitution has for them, they have this affinity to it, and they think it's a very important document. But to me, the big takeaway also was, wow, this is a huge teaching moment too, where so they don't know stuff. Maybe after they took the survey, they went and read the Constitution, or so that passion about the Constitution showed up in the survey and what we see at PopVox.
Susan, what about you?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, Judy, and thank you to Montpelier. This is a great and, I think, timely event in many ways. We're not having an evergreen conversation about the Constitution, and I think that does show up pretty clearly in the survey. First of all, Rachna's point is very well taken. For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, it's almost hilarious if it weren't maybe a little bit depressing, the extent to which Americans have such a healthy self-regard for their knowledge, which is not matched by their actual knowledge. I believe it was over 70%, like well over 70%, who said they felt that they knew a lot about the Constitution, but it was under 30% of them who were able to say the process by which the Constitution would be amended and added to.
I was going to let you make that point.
You know, so stipulate that we've got some, where Montpelier and the archives have some genuine proselytizing to do. I defer to their expertise on the best way, but in all seriousness, right, we are living in this moment, it seems to me, where we're back to first principles and basic questions, both about our democracy and its health, about our history, and the role that our institutions of democracy play in the present day. So that's why I say it's an extremely timely conversation to be having. And I said this the other day to an international visitor I was talking with, that in the last few years, and in particular with this very divisive and polarizing 2016 election, and this, I believe the current White House phrase is this very unconventional president that we have, basically, right, we're living at a moment that seems so different so quickly from where we were living just a few years ago. Not in terms of the polarization, which is certainly something that has been happening in our politics far more than in the last couple years, right? We can all acknowledge that Donald Trump may reflect that polarization or even widen it further, but he certainly didn't create it. But still, the Obama era, even the Bush era, it seemed to me, living in Washington, working as a journalist, it was a much more technocratic time. We talked about behavioral economics and what are the best policies to nudge new behavior. It was an incrementalism that suggested that we had shared values, even if we were increasingly divided over our politics. And I feel like today we're back to, wait a minute, do we have to have a conversation about the First Amendment and the role of independent media? So again, I feel like it's very valuable in the sense that it hits the moment we're in.
A different time, and yet we just keep chugging along, thanks in large part to the Constitution. Hassan, what about you?
Well, I'm happy to report that the students who I engage with are aware that there is a Constitution. Now, to assume that they are to know what's in the Constitution, that's something completely different. And I think, unfortunately, the degree to which our young people in general, speaking in very general terms, are familiar with sort of what the Constitution says, what the facts of the Constitution, is sadly disappointing. However, there is something about the moment, because even in my, anecdotally, what I've detected from my students is a genuine interest in trying to figure out, like, what is this all about? What's at stake? In a way that I haven't heard.
You mean especially at this moment? At
this particular moment, in the era in which we're living, in the era of Trump and everything that's going on in the news, that's being reported in the news, that just hearing the sort of constitutional crisis and the questions that they have about the Constitution, and just that they have questions about the Constitution, is something that is new to this generation and unique to this moment. And I don't think it's just limited to the classroom. I think it's something that the public as a whole is really looking at anew and in new ways.
And I think that is a perfect segue to the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, because by the way, when you get a chance, look at the results of this survey. It doesn't take that long to look at them. They really are interesting, and there's a lot to dig into. But the first thing I want to raise is that what this survey shows is that 8 in 10 Americans are worried, no matter whatever they know about the Constitution, they are worried that some of their constitutional rights are being diluted or are being taken away. How do we read that? How do we understand that, Rachna?
So from a looking at it right now moment, what I've seen through my work is the level of concern from Americans about things like the First Amendment and trying to figure out what's at stake right now. But that level of concern, if you looked 5 years back, was there, but in a different way with a different set of people. 5 years ago on Pop Vox, this was after Sandy Hook, and there were a lot of people very concerned about what's going to happen to the Second Amendment and what rights can be taken away. And a lot of people trying to hold their lawmakers accountable, and especially holding President Obama accountable to not take away those rights. The conversation since then has shifted to a whole other host of issues about what's the role of the president and what's the role of journalists in our national conversation. So it's a different set of people that have been really activated and that are really concerned, and they're concerned in a different way.
So you think the 80% today is different from what the 80% would have been a few years ago?
Yeah.
Susan?
We don't have data. We're hoping that this will become an annual survey, so we don't have anything, exactly, to compare it with historical data over the last few years. My personal guess would be that 80% number is way higher than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, and that the drumbeat of hearing that we're having a constitutional crisis makes people believe that we are, in fact, having a constitutional crisis. And it's a little bit of a hard one because I think there are different elements of it depending on your political perspective, where you are, what's happening in your own world, right? So many people might agree that there's a constitutional crisis, but have very, very different components of it, And I think, again, I found that 80% figure to be one of the most striking findings in this survey. I think it should cause all of us great alarm, regardless of what your particular point of view about what the nature of that crisis is. I think it suggests that this is a moment of inward-looking anxiety about the state of American democracy. There are other surveys outside of this one that have shown something I never thought to see in my lifetime, I have to say, which is an actual decline in support for the very concept of democracy as a form of government here in the United States, as well as in key countries of not only, say, Eastern Europe, but also of Western Europe. We have today visiting Washington the president of Poland. You would think that only 25 years after the fall of communism and the end of the Soviet Union, that this would have been seen as one of the great, sort of victories for democracy in our time, and yet not only are they rolling back democratic institutions, and there's literally a war between the judiciary and the elected president, notwithstanding an excellent constitution, by the way, written with help of American advisors after the collapse of communism. But you have a president who is welcoming one side in that fight, an America that has basically is looking at home to 80% of its public worrying about their own rights, and has more or less ceded largely its role as an international propagator of democracy.
And Hassan, just picking up on what you said earlier, you are seeing tangible concern about whether rights are here to stay. So that 80%, and I don't want to get too hung up on the exact number, because as Susan said, we don't know what it was, but we heard Rachna say, there was concern before today, but coming from perhaps a different part of the American population.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out, I can't think of too many other things that you can get 80% of Americans to agree on, period. So that number, that number is high, but the reality is, if you sort of track it, if we were able to track it over time, there are people who are genuinely, who for them, their rights and their concern for their rights is truly legitimate, right? If you are a non-citizen in this particular moment, Constitution applies to everybody, doesn't talk about citizenship. Right. If you are a non-citizen, you have a legitimate, your fears and concerns about your rights being trampled, your constitutional rights here, are legitimate. But you have some folk who would line up in that 80%, where their concern, I truly question. And part of it is the moment in which we live, right? I mean, historically, we can talk about the groups that have actually had their rights limited. Women, African Americans, people of color. White men have done pretty good as far as the Constitution has played out. And so when we hear today, not just about white men, but especially within some in particular political circles, our rights are under threat. It's like, hold on, right? And the problem with that is the problem when you are, when essentially, when your rights aren't actually being threatened, but suddenly you feel as though they are, then the questions about the democracy come up, right? Because if you're saying that in this democracy, a place in which your rights aren't actually being threatened, but that they are, then what is it that you want as an alternative? So that number isn't just sort of a fanciful statistic that it's like, oh, that's really interesting. The implications for how that breaks down are really important, right? Because they reflect not only people's politics in the moment, but where do those politics lead them as it relates back to democracy in America?
And Rachna, from your work, do you have a sense of how that is? I mean, as people think about, if they're worried, if that many Americans today, and we know that can cover so many different aspects of the Constitution, and whether it's civil liberties, whether it's the First Amendment, freedom of the press, do you have a sense of where concerns are rising on the part of the American people?
So what we often see is a subset of the public, because not everyone is going to go talk to their lawmaker about an issue that's important to them, or the Constitution for that matter. What always surprises me is that feeling of, oh, my rights are under attack, but then what are you going to do about it next? Are you going to research what's actually in the Constitution so you know whether your rights are being attacked, or are you going to go talk to a lawmaker about it? And the people that actually do is a much smaller group, and they're the ones that are pushing for new rights or changes to the Constitution. And one example that comes to mind is around parental rights and the fear of the United Nations, the Declaration of the Rights of Children. That was a huge issue a couple of years ago. We still see parents in the United States really concerned that the United Nations is going to come in and tell them how to raise their children. And that I could see if someone was taking the survey, a parent like that who's homeschooling their child thinking, oh no, now the United Nations is going to tell me how to raise my kid. They feel their rights are threatened, even though there's nothing in the Constitution about how you're supposed to raise your kids. So that, my point being, what lawmakers hear and actually what's happening is a very different, there's a distinction there.
Susan, do you see that in your reporting?
Well, look, I think you could argue that these are all manifestations not only of a polarized political system that we have now, but also of one in which basic facts are increasingly at issue, and they are increasingly non-intersecting, sort of bubbles of viewpoints and opinions, and so that homeschooler who believes that the black-booted thugs are going to come and take their children away. By the way, I read a fantastic book this summer, this memoir, Educated, by Tara Westover, who is a very interesting young woman who's now, I believe, a history professor, but came from a family that was literally like that. And she writes very movingly towards the end of that book, actually, exactly the scenario you described, more or less, which is that her father really had her convinced, and her siblings, even though she reacted against him ultimately, really had them convinced that the government was coming into homes where the parents were keeping their children out of school and taking the children away. And that was used in her family as an excuse. That narrative about protecting them and securing their rights was used as an excuse for many of the families' otherwise inexplicable kind of secrecy and things like that. But more broadly, Judy, I think the point goes back to Hassan's one, which is like, how do we connect the sort of false perception in a way that we are more united than we might seem? It's easy to say, well, we're, look, 80% of us agree on this, or, the list of political issues, in fact, that are highlighted in this survey. It's a pretty stable list. I mean, that would have been the same list 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? People are worried about gun rights. They're worried about abortion. They're worried about freedom of speech or privacy in this age of technology and social media. Yeah, but the numbers quickly get a lot smaller in terms of the consensus around what to do or how our political system actually works. And I think the thing to me that's different working in Washington, in the last few years, is a sense that the system has broken down so much that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to anymore, or that it won't produce expected results, and that therefore the gap between, say, a vast majority of the public wanting there to be more action taken to restrict gun rights after Sandy Hook or after the shooting in Florida this year, the numbers are overwhelming, right? If we had democracy by, plebiscite or by, genuinely popular rule, right, we'd have had a very different legislative framework than we have right now, and so I think this sense of frustration adds to the sense of crisis, the idea that the government and the political system isn't working in the way that the framers of the Constitution intended. There might be more of a consensus on that across right and left. But then B, I think unfortunately that's undercut by the increasing divergence between facts and opinions, and the fact that, you're entitled historically to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And now I think, that really has hampered our ability to resolve any of these issues. And to me, that's why all goes into that 80% number. That is the crisis in many ways, and that might be the one thing that we can agree upon.
Yeah, I'm glad, and by the way, maybe we need an amendment that protects our right to facts, but we're not there yet. But I'm so glad, Rachna, that you brought up the people worried about whether the government was going to let the UN or some other international body take over, whether the government was going to come in and take over people's lives, because it is a reminder that we do see our rights differently based on where we sit, where we stand, where we come from in many ways. I was just looking at one of the results of the survey. While 85% of Americans believe the Constitution is a safety net that protects their rights, only 74% of African Americans agree with this statement. And I immediately, Hassan, think about police and the role of police in our communities, civil rights, voting rights. And you begin to understand how if you are a part of our society that has experienced life at the wrong end, arguably, of these issues, you're going to see this completely differently. In fact, I'm surprised in some regards that it's 74%, that it's that high.
Now, the survey is interesting because it's not so much a measure of sort of facts, like of knowledge, right? What do people know and understand about the Constitution, as it is a measure of feeling. Like, how do people feel about these constitutional protections? And that's one of those survey results that's very telling, that tells us exactly what you said, that people's interaction, people's feelings about the Constitution is very much dictated by their lived experience. And that lived experience isn't just the sum of their sort of life years on this earth, but it's the full effect of their social group, their social category. So it's the sum of the black experience when people are talking about their relationship with the police, right? You may, as an individual, as an African American, may have had very limited interaction with police, depending upon where you are, and still you get nervous with every interaction because you're drawing on this historical experience. And so how does that translate? That just isn't limited to one's individual critique of sort of a particular police department. It speaks to the sort of the society and the nation as a whole. And so the concern is what does government represent, and how is that translated with regard to the Constitution and the protections that I'm supposed to have, that I am entitled to as a person of color living here as an American citizen, that historically have been denied me. And that puts black folk, that puts other groups in a different situation vis-a-vis the Constitution, struggling to get the rights that they are entitled to, and not feeling that they are being granted and fully observed. That leaves you in a different place, right? And it was a different place before 2008 election, Barack Obama. It's a different place now in 2016. I mean, it's amazing how that can turn those feelings so immediately.
And if I could add to that, another point in the survey that I found striking is the feeling that your rights were being respected increased as income level increased. So the higher income individual surveyed felt that their rights were respected way more than someone making, say, $25,000 a year. And I'm sure if the question was asked about immigrants, like you had brought up, it would be very similar concerns as well.
In many ways, it makes sense, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
well, that's right. I mean, there's the perception of, who feels themselves to be the stakeholders, in society and therefore in its institutions, the people who are benefiting and have benefited the most from it. And I think that's partially why I see this as sort of just a very interesting set of data points, along with a whole host of others, frankly, that are blinking red. And I think, what I have looked at, given my interest in foreign policy over the last few years, is the fact that people don't perceive themselves to be stakeholders in what we have seen as the building blocks of this liberal international order. Like, what is the rules-based liberal international order? Well, it turns out maybe we can describe it, but a lot of people don't really feel anymore, I think, why is the United States still leading NATO? What is it about the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank, put aside the UN? To me, that is all related to the issues we're having about our own institutions of government. And I think it shows the ability of whether it's one individual politician or an entire party around him to attack in a sustained way the institutions, by the way, that have been built and led by the United States for its own benefit, for the last 70 years. It's really, I've just been fascinated by this phenomenon because it suggests that our perception about people seeing themselves as stakeholders in these institutions, in our democracy, was much lower, or perhaps it calcified over time. We've taken it for granted. We don't educate people about these things. I mean, it's all related, but I would tie it back absolutely to those interesting numbers about why race and class and ethnicity probably really matter in your perception about your rights and the Constitution.
If I could just add
Yeah.
quickly to that, when talking about race and economic status and sort of income, that also speaks to the point of interaction that a person has with government. It's very much based upon sort of your race, your economic status, which I mean, if you are poor, you're interacting with different elements and aspects of government than if you are middle class, than if you are wealthy, and if you are white, and if you are black. And that all frames how people interact, and the points of interaction with government all frame how they feel about government, because those interactions can be so different.
I have to say, if you don't think this is an immediate issue, last night on our program, and I'm sure it's been covered in so many other news organizations, our reporter who was down in Wilmington, North Carolina, going around, and in New Bern, North Carolina, where they have had severe flooding, went to a public housing project and talked to people there where they were hit really serious flooding, excuse me, and talked to them about how they had not heard all day long, or in the previous day, they weren't given a warning about what to look for with the weather. And then the day of the flooding, when it came, and many of them were forced out of their homes, not a single person from the city had come to check on them. Whereas other parts of the city, our reporter went around and interviewed people. So just a small example like that at a moment of crisis in someone's life, whether the government is there to lend a helping hand, give you advice, that's how you visualize the government, whether it's at the federal or the state or the local level. It all comes together. I want to read another. There's so many, as I said, so many fascinating findings. At least 90% or more of respondents ranked. This is when people were asked to rank your top personal concerns about what you know of the Constitution. At least 90% or more ranked civil rights, data privacy, voting rights, and freedom of the press as top personal concerns, beating out issues like gun control and abortion, which get so much attention, we know, in our coverage. However, when you ask individuals to name the most pressing issues facing the country, not themselves personally, but facing the country, 53% of Americans said gun control. I want to ask the three of you, how do you see that? Where do you think that's coming from? Rachna?
So for us, for me, it made sense because you might not have had a mass shooting in your community, but you see it on TV, and it is scary enough that it's gotten people to actually take action and do something, whether it's you support the Second Amendment or you feel that there needs to be more gun control laws. What we saw, say, on PopFox was activism around every time there's a mass shooting, activism on the part of people that want more gun control. But interestingly enough, what we'd see from people that support the Second Amendment and support gun rights and want gun rights expanded, in fact, it's a much steadier drumbeat. It's not like an uptick right after a mass shooting, but every time a single gun bill gets introduced, there's people that are calling their member of Congress or writing a letter or doing something to voice their concerns. Now, that's what Congress hears, and that's, for a lot of this, why they take action or don't take action. I think what was interesting to me is how few of the people surveyed probably own guns, because gun rights was very low on the list personally. Right. But I think it was just that motivating factor where they did take action, or they even if it was just tweeting at their lawmaker, they did something, and that created that affinity to that issue, and that's why it came up.
Again, it was asking people what's important to the country, not so much what's important to you.
Although, interestingly, right, there is the perception that this is a constitutional issue, and there are some others that are on that list as well. To me, that speaks, again, to the gridlock in the country and the perception that the normal legislative process doesn't work or is broken down. Many of the issues on that list, it's highly debatable whether we need new legislation as opposed to constitutional amendment. Now in the case of guns, you're looking at basically a political war in the country over the question of interpretation of one of the Constitution's amendments. And therefore, it's really a broad conversation we've been having, not just in the last 2 years, obviously, but for a number of years, about how to interpret the Second Amendment. What is the role of the judiciary, in our democracy? We, of course, are being treated once again to the spectacle of a big Supreme Court nomination fight, in which certainly guns factor in, not explicitly this week. We'll be talking about not that, but to me, the issue is that we certainly have the ability. Congress does, state legislatures do have the ability to make many more laws of all variety, whether of the limiting variety or of the not limiting variety, when it comes to guns and the role that they play in our public safety and law enforcement. Is it a constitutional issue? Not in the sense of anyone seriously thinking we're going to open up the hood and, you know, tinker with the wording in the Second Amendment and, you know, fix it up, right? But nonetheless, I think sometimes people frame this conversation around rights in very big, high-altitude terms when they've kind of thrown up their hands and despaired of any more concrete political resolutions to some of these issues.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that we, the people, separate out what we see as personally very important in terms of the priority list and what we see as being important nationally. Because that separation, the fact that they're not the same, says that how we go about trying to solve them is somehow different too, right? I mean, so the personal issue of sort of voting rights and people see sort of freedom of speech, these sort of very personal things, right? It's stuff we do every day, these sort of interactive things that we do every day. Whereas gun rights, certainly people are touched by that, and not to make a small light of that, but if you're looking just at the number of people who own guns, the vast majority of Americans do not own guns, and the vast majority of Americans are never touched by gun violence. But yet we see it, right? And it becomes very palpable. And so the difference between the two, I think, is important, not just for us to understand, but then also for our legislative representatives to understand that there are these sort of high altitude issues, but then there are also these sort of very day-to-day issues that people still see reflected in the Constitution.
So what are the lessons of, just of this particular thing? Rashna, you touched on this, for our lawmakers, for our leaders, for our president, for our Congress. I mean, when they see how Americans feel invested in, that they do think about the rights, voting rights, civil rights, and so on, but they don't, but they understand that the political debate isn't about some of the things that may be the most important to them politically. How do you think our political leaders see that?
That's where it gets tricky, because if every member of Congress took a survey of all their constituents, and you don't have to be a citizen to be a constituent, they're supposed to represent all of us. If they took a survey of their districts and asked them, what's the most important issue, you'd get things like raising the minimum wage, or childcare, or having time off to care for an ill family member, or you'd get these really personal crisis issues. But unfortunately, not all of us write to their lawmakers, or not all of us have the luxury of knowing their lawmakers. And I think that disconnect, and taking aside the political money aspect of things, that disconnect creates a very different, but it does create a disconnect between what people are feeling and what lawmakers are hearing. And my thing is always, well, if you have something to say, go say it. There's so many ways you can say it. There's also this sense, when Susan touched on gridlock, the system is built by the framers to be a slow process, because they didn't want too much power in government. And that creates this very lengthy process to get anything, even a constitutional amendment, passed through. And now we live in an era more than ever where we expect things instantly, like whether it's like you click for food or a car or anything, you see it instantly, and that's not how our lawmakers designed our level of government.
So the idea that an amendment would take a long time to get through Congress, not to mention getting through 2/3 of the state legislatures.
Right.
Three-fourths of the state legislature.
Listening to Rasha, I wonder to what extent what we're seeing reflected there, and the difference between what is personally important to you and then what is sort of big picture important nationally, are we actually seeing the influence of sort of big money? Are we seeing the influence of lobbying? That the personal is what actually, all politics are local, right? The personal, what things people identifying personally as being important to them, is what is really meaningful to them. And then these national things, sort of gun rights and the other, are what they are hearing is important. What they're hearing the nation is saying. And that's partly a function of, literally hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into various campaigns and advertising and lobbying around particular issues. You need to be paying attention to this, or else these gun rights are going to be taken away. So I wonder if we're also hearing that or seeing that in those numbers as well.
Well, I mean, to be a little bit, sanguine, frankly, about the results, I think you could look at this if you were sitting, on Pennsylvania Avenue, on either end, frankly, and you could say, well, this is great. This is great for me. The one thing that Americans agree upon is that, there's a crisis, and I can help define it. And since we're talking about Constitution and rights and at a pretty high level of abstraction, there's no real sense, that anybody's going to hold me accountable for actually, passing an amendment to the Constitution. We all know that's not going to happen. So there's a built-in political incentive in many ways that I think we've seen play out in recent decades. And frankly, whether it's an organized lobby group or the ability of money arguably easier than ever before thanks to Citizens United decision and others to influence the political discourse. There's an incentive in our political system right now to get people concerned about very big picture framing of their rights, and that is true on the left as well as the right. And in part, the expectation implicitly that we all know, that there's no legislation or constitutional amendment that's going to result from that conversation, actually makes the barrier to entry almost disappear for a politician who wants to create and play off of the already existing American sense of crisis. So again, I don't see that it's necessarily good news in this survey when you look and see that people perceive their rights to be under threat. If you're a liberal politician, guess what? It's good sense to go to your core district and to talk about voting rights being under assault, and that terrible Supreme Court is gonna take even more of those away if we don't elect Democrats in November. And conversely, if you live in a place with a very high percentage of gun ownership, why not talk about the threat to the Second Amendment? Again, to me, this survey sort of underscores that.
Yeah, it's a reminder to me again, and I see some numbers here, of how our politics today is so sliced and diced. We now know that the politicians pay big money to target specifically block by block of house by house, apartment by apartment, people who are going to agree with them on issues. Just back on that last point I raised, where about you ask people what are the issues that are most important facing the country, not themselves personally. As I mentioned, 53% more than any other said gun rights and gun control. Of that, 58% of that was 58% of women believe that, 48% of men. So we can assume that more women were concerned, just because of what other polls show. Women are concerned about gun control than gun rights. The next highest, most important issue for the nation, civil rights, 41%. And of that, 62% of African Americans said that's important. 36% of white Americans, 45% of Hispanic, and 41% of Asian Americans. Again, it's another reminder of how we are in our, I don't want to say silo, but we do come to these issues from our community, how we define ourselves. Okay, so there's so many I want to ask. I want to come back to so many issues here I want to ask you about. When you ask people what is most important to you, civil rights, the top, 96%. Voting rights, right behind it, 95%. Data privacy, 95%. It's fascinating with the rise of the internet. It's right behind that. Freedom of the press, thankfully, people, 91% hanging in there. Right ahead of religious freedom, the same thing, 90% before you get to the other issues. But here's something related to all that. More than 65% of Americans believe that ethnic minorities and women do not always experience the constitutional rights they're entitled to. So it's 65%, it's 2/3, it's not everybody, but it is a recognition, Rachna, that people are aware of what all Americans are facing.
And that's a really important part of us trying to have this dialogue, us meaning our country at this moment, having a conversation and having a little bit of empathy about what other people are going through. And maybe that's because of social media that we're seeing videos of these experiences people have. And I like to be optimistic about this, and that maybe this will help us understand each other's experiences. But at the same time, as communities and schools become segregated based on class issues, like rich students, poor students having completely different experiences, how is that going to work out for the next generation? And young people especially, and I think the survey was over 18 years old, but when you look at the cohort coming up now, the ones that have been really energized by the shootings at Parkland, for example, how are they going to assess what their role is in our government and how to interact with our government? So it just gave me a lot more questions to ask.
Well, it's interesting. You pointed out about gender and how there's a gender gap on the gun issue, for example. There is clearly a gap on not just class, but race or ethnicity when it comes to, confidence, basically, in these rights and whether they're given. But there was a very interesting number in there to me as well around gender. I think it was like 53% thought that maybe if there was going to be a future amendment, we should look at a gender equality one. And I wanted to bring that up because that was a big majority relative to some of the other things that people brought up. B, it's a reminder that some of our fixed assumptions about what's possible in American politics, maybe we're entering into a broader period of re-examining them. I mean, I remember my first memory really of any live action constitutional fight, right, was the death of the Equal Rights Amendment in the early 1980s. Despite, by the way, polls would show that a majority of Americans then and now supported it. It basically failed in the states.
But now, last month, I believe, Illinois became the 37th state to ratify it.
Correct. It's not actually dead, which is a very interesting.
One more state.
That's right.
We don't want to rush into this, right?
Well, but that's exactly what I
give women their rights, and you just, you don't know what it could lead to.
They wanted a slow
let's
process.
not be crazy here. Like Saudi Arabia is going to experiment with women driving. So, that's my favorite one because the rest of the world has tried it out, and there's some okay results, so they're gonna dip their toe in the water.
I'm sure there's a lot of women driver jokes that people are thinking about right now.
But as you can tell, none of the women on the panel is sensitive about this question of women's rights at all. Right? Okay, we're almost coming down to the end of the time, but I want to. 41% of Americans believe this is, 4 in 10 Americans believe the Constitution needs to be amended. About 3 in 10 are not so sure. Americans, by and large, are kind of satisfied, Hassan, aren't they, with what this Constitution says? Witness the failure of the ERA.
Right. That's a tough one to kind of really dissect because there's a lot there. One of the things that makes the U.S. Constitution so unique is that it's not very long, and it hasn't been amended, and it's difficult to amend, and it hasn't been amended very much. That's one of the things that makes it stand out. So there's not a lot of historical memory of changes actually being made to the Constitution. So to a certain extent, I think some of that is a sense that you don't change the Constitution, right? You just sort of work within its parameters. Because you're talking about 70% or so of the people are saying, so I don't know if that's so much, we're satisfied with it, as it is, it is what it is, and we make it work. And it's subject to change, and it's subject to interpretation. But what's there, the sort of the foundation, is workable, it's malleable. And so we don't need to go tinkering with it too much. We just reinterpret it as time progresses and evolves, and eventually we'll get to where we need to be.
That we know it's an imperfect document, but we're getting there. Does it surprise you, Rachna, that so many people are satisfied, seem satisfied?
No, because I thought that question, the more interesting part of that question was the next question about, if you were to amend it, what would you want to see?
The right to privacy. Is that the one?
I think it was the right to privacy. There was gender equality. There was human trafficking. A lot of human rights issues. And we can say that our Constitution was a product of its time, and where the biggest concern was having a monarchy or having a independent judicial system. Whereas when you look at more recent constitutions, or even just documents globally, you see more attention to gender equity, human rights. You see the things about the right to education or the right to health care, and you see more than what our Constitution was about. And so when I saw that list of what people would like to change about our Constitution, the fact that human trafficking was up there, something that I had never thought you would want to put into the Constitution, or gender equality. It made me think that, wow, people are really forward thinking in all this, and that assuming, since they didn't know what's really in our Constitution, they hadn't been reading other constitutions, but it would create like a really good case study to look at, say, like Canada or South Africa, and see what's in theirs, and maybe there is opportunity.
Although, I guess I hate to be, once again, sort of the skeptic here, but I think Hassan's point is really well taken. This is a document that is only as good as the people who interpret it, as the lawmakers who, are charged with carrying it forward. The Soviet Union had a fantastic constitution. It was better than our constitution in some key respects. And it was the Soviet Union, and that's the thing. And I think rightfully Americans have been extremely conservative, small non-ideological C, around how it looks at the process of changing and updating that Constitution. But I guess just as we close, I want to go back to that 80% figure, because it seems to me that if you look at American history, Americans perceive there to be a constitutional crisis, and they perceive themselves to be really actively debating first principles and debating basic questions about our government and our rights at moments of great crisis. And, I think that we are at one of those hinge points where it's clear that we've moved into, a different historical period in our democracy, where 25 years since the end of the Cold War, and a national consensus has frayed about ourselves here at home and our role in a rapidly changing world. And I think that all of these are part of a broad battery of indicator lights that are blinking red on our democracy. And so I don't take comfort from the fact that people are willing to discuss these, because I don't have a lot of confidence that there is anything close to consensus. So maybe, in a way, that's why it's a good thing we have this very conservative tradition of amending our Constitution, because it's a little bit of a frightening thing to think about. If we had an easier process of changing that document, what could result?
And again, a reminder, I think that at this point in particular, to have these metrics right now, I think is critical, which is why I think we owe such a debt of gratitude to Montpelier for doing this survey, for thinking to do it, to think about the meaning of the Constitution, and to ask Americans how they relate to the Constitution. I think you've done a great service, Kat, you and all your colleagues at Montpelier, to ask Americans to do this at this moment. Well, as you can tell, there's a whole lot here. We touched the surface. I think we touched the important surfaces of the survey, and I'm thrilled to have been here with Rachna, with Susan, with Hassan to talk about it. So I hope we've whetted your appetite. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and I think this is just the beginning of the conversation. we the people, to form a more perfect union, have to be engaged in having this conversation all the time with one another. Someone joked with me the other day that their worry about a constitutional amendment would be you'd either get ERA or The Handmaid's Tale. You know, it could go either way. I would invite you, please come visit James Madison's Montpelier. In person would be great, but go online and take the survey as well, and keep the faith, and we will see you again here next year. Thank you all very much.